In horticulture, beginners and experts will encounter glossary, botanical terms, and names which at first can be very unnerving and confusing, particularly if you're unfamiliar with them. But when you hear these terms and names again and again, eventually they become more commonplace and understandable. The reason we use botanical names is, for instance, orchids are a huge family. There are 28,000 different species of orchids that are recorded, and then you have hybrids on top of that. So to try and name everything using just one language is almost impossible. So we use botanical terms taken from two different languages, often Greek and Latin, to try and describe the habit of plants and give some insight into how they grow. This can be useful for orchidists and horticulturalists in general, where, for instance, we want to understand what type of plant to place in a particular location. Let's say, for instance, you were tasked with planting a narrow street, with oak trees, because oaks are very good for the environment. But you see that you can get hold of two different types. One has a fastigiate habit and the other is divaricate. When you try to understand the growth habits of two different plants which are named as such, the answer for many of you will be intuitive, and it's because the languages that botany uses is based in the languages we speak. English comes from German and French, but its root is in Greek and Latin very often. The two words we had to describe the habit of the oak trees for street planting, one was divaricate, which sounds like division, spreading, going apart from each other, therefore probably a spreading habit, and fastigiate, which has many terms like fast friends, stuck fast to something. So you imagine that a fastigiate habit would be one which is much more closely compacted, and you'd be right in that. Here we have an example of a tree called Quercus rubra fastigiate costa. Quercus is the genus for all oak trees. Rubra is the species name. In this case, rubra is the English oak. Cultivar is fastigiate, and the name cultivar is costa. That general naming for plants you'll find across all species and plants that we deal with in the horticultural trade. The orchid family, Orchidaceae, is the second largest plant family. There are 28,000 accepted species across 763 genus. To categorize this huge number more manageably, the family is being divided into 5 subfamilies and then further into tribes and subtribes. We won't look at the tribes and subtribes here, it just gets too confusing. I just want to have a look at the 5 subfamilies first, because there are some identifiable aspects between those 5 subfamilies that you'll probably be able to accept. In the horticultural trade, and for us orchidists, us amateurs, we also use the term Orchid Alliance, and this is groups like we would call the Cattleya Alliance or the Oncidium or Odontoglossum Alliance. And this is where we categorize very similar genus into a grouping which we can breed with. The names of the 5 subfamilies, some of them will be very familiar sounding. The first one there, Apostodiae, which you'll have to forgive my pronunciation because you can see they're quite complicated words to speak. That's quite a primitive orchid, and I've never come across it, and it's unlikely you will ever come across it. But they look a little bit like red hot pokers. They are often found in the Far East and in Polynesia, and they are primitive in that they still retain some aspect of other angiosperms, flowering plants, in that they have 3 anthers, where most modern orchids or advanced orchids only have 1. The next family there is Vanilloideae, that has 15 genera and 180 species in it, found in humid tropical and subtropical regions, as well as eastern North America. And the first part of that name, vanilla, gives you an idea about what plant is actually in with that family. It is the family which contains vanillas. The next family you see there is Cypripoideae. This has 5 genera and 130 species. It's found in temperate regions as well as tropical America and tropical Asia. These are all the slipper orchids. All of those cypripediums that you see hardy orchids growing outside. I've had some photos of the one that I have here on my balcony on the WhatsApp group. That's included in that family, along with all the Paphiopedilums and the Phragmipediums, which come from southern America, South America. That's that family. So it's very different from all the other orchids. The next family is Epidendroideae. This is a huge family. There's over 500 genera with that family, about 20,000 species. It's known as being a cosmopolitan family because it's found everywhere. Most of the orchids that we grow, the Oncidiums, the Cattleyas, Epidendrums, all of these orchids are all in that family. That contains nearly all the orchids we grow. In fact, the family before, the Cypripoideae and the Epidendroideae, nearly contain all the orchids that we grow in as hobbyists. But there are also terrestrial versions of Epidendroideae, and one of those is the Epipactis, which is the helleborines that we have growing here in Ireland, and in particular the helleborine that was found growing in the front square at Trinity College Dublin belongs to that family. Orchids are rare, but they are also have huge variety. And another family, the last family there, is the named family, the Orchidoideae, which is all our terrestrial orchids that you see growing in Ireland, nearly all of them anyway, and across all of our temperate climates. And included in there are species like Anacamptis pyramidalis, which is the pyramidal orchid native to Ireland. And funnily enough, in Trinity College, on that square, you had the Epipactis growing and the Anacamptis orchid growing. 2 different families, only 3 plants growing in that square, where there were thousands of grasses and clover and ranunculus and other plants growing on that square, but only 3 of them were orchids, and yet they stood out from all the others, and they belong to 2 different families. So when I talk about the huge variety of orchids, this is what we're talking about. They're rare, but there's huge variety. In this slide here, I'm trying to describe how orchids are named and the naming convention for nearly all plant species. First of all, we have the family Orchidaceae. Then we have the subfamily, which we were describing earlier. In this instance, I'm choosing the Cypripoideae family. This has, as you saw, 5 genus, and I have 3 of them listed here: Paphiopedilum, Phragmipedium, and Cypripedium. Within each of those genus, there are several species, and a species is generally accepted as being the largest group of a biological entity, a biological life form that can successfully interbreed with itself and produce progeny that look like itself. So under Paphiopedilum there, I've selected 2 different species, Delenatii and Insigne. And under Phragmipedium, I have Baceae and Covacea. Or Baceae, I think is probably correctly pronounced, and Covacea. Covacea is quite a newly discovered Phragmipedium. It has absolutely gigantic flowers, nearly 6 inches, about nearly 20 centimeters across. Beautiful flower. Have a look at it online if you can find it, and it's very expensive to buy it. Baceae is found quite frequently in collections. I have one, and then I also have Delenatii in my collection, and Insigne there, you see, that's used a lot in breeding of hybrids in Paphiopedilums. From Delenatii, we have 2 varieties or cultivars listed here. There are more, but I'm just listing 2 here. A variety or a cultivar is a man-made selection, not rather man-made, but where humans have selected traits within the variation that you find, natural variation you find within species. Selections are made, and those are kept isolated, bred with each other to create a strain, a variety or a cultivar which holds true. Sometimes you can only maintain the particular type, color through vegetative propagation, but sometimes you can actually get this through seed as well. So we have there plant at the top there called Delenatii album, and some of you will have seen that plant because I brought one of those along to the March workshop, and we had it in the display. It's the big pure white Delenatii. Delenatii is a type, as the actual species type, has white petals and sepals and a pink pouch, where the album version is all white with just a small amount of yellow right in the throat of the pouch. Vinicolor is another cultivar where the petals have a reddish tinge and the pouch is pink. And you'll see as well there are varieties and cultivars named there for Baceae as well. There are of course varieties and cultivars for Covacea because species have within them a wide variety of variation. We had a look at cultivars and varieties, which are selections that humans make from a species with traits that we like. But there's another way we can create plants or things that we want, and that is through hybridization. So a hybrid is a simple cross within a genus or a species. And here I'm going to give you an example of two species that are crossed to create a primary hybrid. Primary hybrids are crosses between two species. The first cross is known as a primary hybrid. Here we have the genus Cattleya, two species, Endelii and Warneri, or Warneri, and those were crossed in 1911 to create a primary hybrid called Cattleya Queen Mary. They were crossed by J.J. Holden and registered in 1911 with the RHS. And that's something important. Every orchid cross, every orchid hybrid, for it to be officially recognised, has to be registered with the Royal Horticultural Society in the UK. And it doesn't matter whether you are in Japan, whether you are in America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. To have a hybrid officially recognised, a hybrid name officially recognised, it has to be registered with the RHS. I do believe as well that the American Orchid Society has a listing as well. But that's an example of a hybrid, a simple cross with a genus, within a genus, or within species. Earlier on, I was talking about the idea of where in horticultural trade and within orchidists, hobbyists, we use the term orchid alliance. And this is where we group together orchids that are from very similar genus, very similar families together and call that an alliance. So the two that we would know most well are the Oncidium odontoglossum alliance and the Cattleya alliance. When you cross two different genuses, you get a hybrid which is known as an intergeneric hybrid. And this creates a new genus quite often, which we refer to as a nothogenus. So here's an example of a nothogenus. We take from the alliance Cattleya and Rhyncholalia, and the two species from there is Cattleya alorii and Rhyncholalia digbayana. When they're crossed together, that creates a nothogenus, which is Rhyncholalia Cattleya. We shorten that name to RLC. You will see orchids everywhere online named as RLC. That is the cross between a Cattleya and a Rhyncholalia. That RLC is then given a name and registered with the RHS. Firstly, that cross doesn't produce just one plant. It produces thousands and thousands of plants, probably. But from those are grown on, and the ones that are most outstanding, carry the traits that the breeder was looking for, are selected and put forward to be judged by the RHS and named, and if it's passed, it might get an award, but it's also registered as well with the RHS. In this instance, a cross that was made in 2014 between Cattleya alorii, which is a fairly newly discovered Cattleya, and Rhyncholalia digbayana, which we all know, the big green frilly-lipped Rhyncholalia. That was crossed to create a hybrid, or another word there, Grex, which I'll explain in a minute, called Aladdin, RLC Aladdin. This was made by Hiroishu Ide in 2014 and registered with the RHS in 2014. So what is a Grex? Grex or Gregs comes from the Greek which means to flock together, and it's a term used because things can get so complicated that very complex hybrids are named Grexes or Gregs, and this is where we use this term. Instead of saying a hybrid, which often is a very simplified term, we need to have a word which means something a bit more complicated to give the idea of how complex these crosses can be. So we use the word Grex. Well, can it get more complex? You bet. Orchids say, hold my beer. In this slide, we have a lovely picture of a quite common orchid hybrid or Grex that you will see in a lot of garden centres and on online nurseries. It's a Notho genus called Bulgaria or Oncidopsis is the other name for that. And this one is called Nelly Isler, and it's a variety which is orange. So this is an orange selection taken from a cross which has been named by the with the RHS, listed with the RHS, called Nelly Isler. That Grex was a cross between another Grex called Stefan Isler and a hybrid called Miltonopsis Kensington. Just look at the Miltonopsis Kensington branch of this family. That is a hybrid between two other Miltonopsis hybrids, Frederick Sander and Kenny. Frederick Sander is a hybrid between a Miltonopsis hybrid and a Miltonopsis species. Where the species have occurred in this breeding of this Nelly Isler, I've put them in a slightly darker colour. So if you count the dark coloured species, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times that species were used to create the Nelly Isler orange variety. When you have, but if you have a look carefully at those species, you'll see some of them are used several times. For instance, Nosolanium, Oncidium nosolanum, is used a couple of times in there. Miltonopsis vexillaria is used twice. But when you have something this complex, we call it a Grex, because it's flocking together of lots of different species across a couple of genus. And it's a very complex hybrid, but this isn't really that complex. There are hybrids with literally hundreds of species bred into them over many, many, many generations. So orchid breeding can be very, very complicated. I mentioned before that one cross doesn't give just one outcome. Anyone who's opened up a vanilla pod will see the thousands of tiny seeds that are found in them, and this is the same for all orchids. Orchid seeds are like dust, and there's thousands of them. When you create these new Nothogenuses and the thousands of plants that grow from the seeds, what normally happens is the breeder will grow those on to flowering, and from those thousands of seeds that he gets, will select 1, 2, 3, or 4 outstanding plants. So the convention is that you first of all give the cross a particular name. Here we have two flowers. They look quite similar and they come from the same cross. And the cross that was made here was between two complex hybrids, two grexes, Rhyncholaleo cattleya, Tokyo Bay, crossed with a cattleya winter gift. And they named this cross first class. And the cross inherited traits from 17 species. Two of the seedlings were given cultivar names. The first was RLC First Class Strawberry Milk. That's the larger picture you see to the right, the first one. And the other cross was named as RLC First Class Snowlets. But the naming of these two cultivars has no relationship to the parent hybrid names, because we're talking about, well, maybe Snowlets perhaps came from Cattleya Winter Gift. That gives you an example of how a complex cross is taken and named. One characteristic that I think is becoming more commonplace now, because orchids are orchid breeding is becoming so complex, is that tending to use the convention that is used in racehorses, where the name of a new cross has some takes some of its naming from the parents. So in this instance here, in 2015, Sawada, which is a very famous orchid nursery in Cattleya nursery in Japan, registered yet another cross with the Royal Horticultural Society. This one was a cross between Cattleya All Glades Grand and RLC First Class Strawberry Milk, which we talked about in the earlier. And this cross was named RLC Grand Class. So they took the Grand from Cattleya All Glades Grand and the class from RLC First Class. I'm hoping that we might be able to see what that cross looks like, because I purchased a small seedling that from Burnham Nursery many years ago, nearly maybe 6 years ago now, and have been having it growing away, and it looks like it might be large enough this year to flower. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a look at that. I also have other crosses with RLC First Class Strawberry Milk, and we'll see what that one will look like as well. So you can see that orchid hybridizing is very complex. It's a cross genus. I don't know of any cross alliance orchids, but I'm sure there might be alliances where crosses have been made between them. But generally it's within what we term our orchid alliances, like the Cattleya Alliance or the Oncidium Alliance, that we make these complex hybrids. I understand that for many people, the naming of plants and the botanical names of plants can be very, very confusing. I was fortunate in that I was educated as a horticulturalist straight out of school, and one of the things we used to do at the afternoon was, the last hour, was to go and take a particular genus like Hebes and learn all the species names and the variety names. So I got a good grounding in the naming and the use of botanical names many centuries ago. But don't get overwhelmed by names. These only become understandable when you use them or hear them spoken more often. But we'll look at other glossary terms as well as we go along, because it is useful if you're trying to successfully grow orchids to understand the glossary terms, like what is a vellum on the white outer coating of the roots, or what is a pseudobulb, why is it different from a bulb or a corm. So we'll have a look at all of this and go into more detail about those terms in another meeting. But I won't lay this too heavily on you. This is just the first step there to hopefully get a bit more insight into the hobby. Thank you very much for listening.